Did you know that even in high-income countries, something like 50% of patients don't actually get treatment for psychiatric disorders?
Hmm.
And in low to middle income countries, well, that figure can shoot up to 85%. 85%.
Quite staggering.
It really is. That's a massive, undeniable treatment gap. The traditional system just isn't bridging it for everyone, is it?
Clearly not.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
This is where we take a stack of sources, articles, research, notes you've sent us, and we pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the key insights.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it as, well, a shortcut to getting properly informed, hopefully with a few surprising facts, maybe just enough humor to keep you listening.
That's good.
Today, we're diving deep into a body of work exploring the profound impact of AI and digital technologies on global healthcare. We're looking particularly at mental health and also the future of our hospitals.
A huge topic.
Absolutely. And guiding us through this really fascinating landscape, I'm joined by Prof. Mo Imam. His ability to synthesize all this diverse information, spot the patterns, connect the dots, it makes him, well, the ideal expert to help us unpack what truly matters in this dense but really crucial material. It's brilliant to have you here.
Thank you. It's a privilege to dive into these sources with you.
So right off the bat, the sources talk about a profound reform coming to health systems. It seems intrinsically linked to this digital transition. If you had to pick one thing, what's the single biggest, most fundamental change you see happening across the sector based on this material?
That's a big question. Based on these sources, I'd say the single biggest change is the radical reshaping of where and how care is actually delivered.
Okay.
It's not just about digitizing the processes we already have. It's more fundamental.
Yeah.
It's about a geographical and functional reorientation.
Right.
The sources strongly suggest a future where the high-level, technologically advanced acute care sort of consolidates within hospitals. But at the same time, there's this massive and necessary push to strengthen care much closer to home, proximity healthcare, primary care, home care.
Oh, okay.
This dual movement, this push and pull, it fundamentally alters the traditional model we're used to.
That tension between the high-tech hospitals and care closer to home, that's really interesting. Now, thinking specifically about mental health, these digital tools, things like smartphone apps, chatbots, they're obviously gaining traction.
They are indeed.
What's the most promising potential application highlighted in these sources for genuinely reaching more people, especially those who are currently underserved?
Well, the most promising application, as the sources really highlight it, lies in the potential for these digital tools to, democratize access.
Right.
And also to provide continuous objective insights.
Right.
Exactly. Think about smartphone apps enabling real-time data collection, data processing. They offer a pathway to get clinical insights that are, relatively cheap, secure, fast, and crucially available to individuals who might face really significant barriers getting to traditional in-person care.
Geographic barriers, stigma.
All of those things. This capability offers a real route to extending support way beyond the clinic walls.
Okay. And the sources also delve into big data and machine learning AI, essentially for predicting health outcomes. Even incredibly sensitive things like suicide risk or psychosis. What's the fundamental shift that represents in how clinicians might actually work day to day?
This shift is, it's really towards what some call precision psychiatry, or you could say truly individualized prediction.
Precision psychiatry, okay.
Yes. So instead of clinicians relying on these episodic, potentially quite subjective reports from patients during infrequent appointments.
Snapshot view.
Exactly. Big data and machine learning models offer the ability to process these vast, multidimensional data streams. This allows for continuous objective insights and, crucially, individualized risk estimates.
Right, for that specific person.
Precisely. It's moving away from a sort of population average view to a much more dynamic understanding and prediction of outcomes for the specific individual patient.
Yeah.
It fundamentally changes the information landscape that's available to the clinician.
Okay, let's really unpack this further then. We're moving into our first proper deep dive segment now, focusing on that broader digital transition you mentioned and how these tools are reshaping care delivery right across the system.
Mm-hmm.
You started by talking about profound reform driven by demographic changes.
Yeah.
What exactly do the sources zero in on when they talk about this big picture transformation?
The sources are actually quite explicit here. They link the future of the health sector very strongly to advances in science and this, what feels like an inevitable digital transition.
Right.
A major driver they identify for this profound reform is the demographic transition specifically. Increased longevity, particularly in more developed countries.
People living longer.
Exactly. People are living longer, and with that comes a greater prevalence of chronic diseases. Health systems simply must be equipped to manage these effectively, often over many years. And this requires a health system that's far more integrated than perhaps our traditional models have allowed for.
So the aging population, the rise of chronic conditions, they're basically forcing this change.
Precisely. And to manage this effectively, the sources call for significantly greater investment in what they term proximity healthcare.
Proximity healthcare, making care closer.
Yes, making care more accessible, closer to where people actually live and need it most. And as I mentioned just now, they articulate this fascinating tension. The need for this high-level, technologically supported acute care within hospitals has to coexist and be effectively integrated with long-term care delivered in primary care settings and home settings. The sources seem to see hospitals increasingly focusing on the complex, acute technological interventions, solidifying their role as centers for specialized procedures.
Okay.
While at the same time, the role of primary health care and home care is vastly strengthened. It's not just an organizational tweak, you see. It's presented in these sources as a fundamental geographical and functional reorientation of the entire health system.
That perspective brings us neatly to the concept of smart hospitals, which is mentioned in the source material. What actually defines a smart hospital according to this body of work? What are the core characteristics?
Well, the sources conceptualize smart hospitals with I'd say, paramount focus on two key things: patient safety and genuine patient-centeredness.
Patient-centeredness.
Yes, they even refer to it as achieving a true patient-centricity model. The aspiration seems to be for pan-European and international health services to really prioritize this transformation.
And is there a driver for this, beyond just wanting things to be better?
Oh yes, the urgency isn't purely theoretical. The sources cite empirical evidence, including an EU survey which found that over a quarter of respondents believed they or a family member had experienced an adverse healthcare event in hospitals.
Wow, over 25%.
Indeed. That stark statistic alone really underscores the vital need for the kind of safety improvements that digital transformation might facilitate.
That figure is quite sobering, isn't it? So it's about safety. It's about the patient experience. How do the sources suggest we actually measure success and drive this complex change towards smarter hospitals? Because presumably it's not just about buying shiny new equipment.
Absolutely not. No, the sources are very clear that governance and, well, sophisticated change management strategies are critical pillars here.
Right.
They call for the design of an evidence-based framework, specifically for measuring both intermediate and long-term outcomes that result from hospital planning, design, and management interventions.
An evidence-based framework.
Yes, and this framework needs to be robust, obviously drawing on data, but also customizable to different national or federal contexts. Furthermore, they really stress that developing, disseminating, and crucially, sustaining these best practices requires extensive partnership.
Partnership with whom?
Well, they mention specific international organizations: the European Society of Quality Healthcare, ESQH, the European Hospital and Healthcare Federation, HAP, the WHO Patients for Patient Safety Program, the International Alliance of Patients Organizations, IAPO, and the European Patients Forum, EPF.
A lot of acronyms there.
Quite. But the point is, collaborating with these bodies, alongside national coalitions, health professional bodies, universities, policymakers, it's presented as absolutely essential for success. It's a deeply collaborative vision, not some sort of top-down technology mandate.
It certainly sounds like it requires broad alignment, a lot of people working together. The sources also use some language that, well, it might sound a bit industrial, maybe manufacturing-like when applied to healthcare. Terms like processes and flow. Can you help us understand that perspective?
It's an interesting perspective, isn't it? It draws on principles often found in production management, as referenced in the material. Concepts articulated by thinkers like Modig and Alstrom, for example.
Okay.
Processes are viewed as structures or perhaps channels through which units move or flow. In this view, flow and process aren't really separate things, but sort of complementary ways of looking at the same phenomenon.
Right.
When you translate that to healthcare, the flow units are fundamentally the patients themselves, along with all their associated information, their medical data, their history, their journey through the system.
I see.
The sources describe patient journeys through the health system, whether that's within a single hospital or across different care settings, as being managed by interconnected functional units.
Functional units, like teams.
Exactly. These units are typically multi-professional teams or what is sometimes called microsystems within a healthcare setting.
So the patient is the unit moving through this system of teams.
That's the core idea. And within this model, care activities are described as being co-created with the patient.
Co-created.
Yes, the goal of this co-creation is to continuously refine value, which in the context of healthcare obviously means improving the patient's health and their well-being.
Mm.
Process models then become these vital tools for describing the structure of this flow. They outline specific roles and responsibilities within the teams. They define how management and continuous development activities are organized. And crucially, they detail how various vertical functional units like specific departments or clinics need to interconnect.
And why is that interconnection so important?
Well, this interconnection is absolute key to ensuring a smooth, efficient patient journey and avoiding what the sources call sub-optimization.
Sub-optimization.
Yes, that's when one part of the system might operate very efficiently in isolation, but inadvertently creates bottlenecks or issues for the overall patient flow. One clinic runs perfectly on time, but the handover to the next stage is chaotic.
Right, I understand. It messes up the whole journey.
Exactly. It's about optimizing the whole journey, not just the individual steps within it.
That reframing of the patient journey as a flow managed through interconnected processes, that's actually really insightful for understanding system design, isn't it?
I think so, yes.
Let's shift gears now and dive into a major theme that weaves through the sources. Digital mental health. We all carry smartphones. The sources clearly see immense potential there.
They absolutely do. The smartphone is presented as a remarkably powerful tool for real-time data gathering and processing.
Real time.
Yes. And this capability is enabling this concept of digital phenotyping.
Digital phenotyping, what exactly is that?
It refers to the ability to quantify aspects of the human phenotype, basically. How an illness manifests in an individual using data that's passively or actively collected from their personal digital devices. Think about the limitations of traditional clinical appointments. They're snapshots in time, aren't they? Relying on patients or caregivers recalling symptoms, which can be subject to recall bias. Or it might only capture variations between those infrequent visits.
Right. You only see what's happening on that particular Tuesday morning.
Precisely. Whereas digital phenotyping offers a way to get a continuous picture.
So it fills in the gaps between appointments.
Exactly. Unlike those intermittent appointments, computers and smartphones can potentially monitor continuously and in real time. This opens the door to developing what are called digital biomarkers.
Digital biomarkers.
These are objective, quantifiable, physiological, or behavioral data points. They can be collected either actively, maybe through app-based questionnaires prompting symptom checks.
Like, how are you feeling today?
Sort of, yes. Or passively through data generated simply by using the smartphone or perhaps wearable sensors.
Okay, what kind of passive data?
Well, this could include things like screen time, patterns of social media interaction, heart rhythm data from a smartwatch, sleep duration and quality, or physical activity levels tracked by the phone's accelerometer. It provides a much richer, more dynamic, continuous stream of data to understand an individual's illness trajectory almost moment to moment.
That ability to get a continuous, objective view of someone's state seems incredibly powerful, especially in mental health where symptoms can fluctuate so much.
It certainly holds that potential, yes.
The sources also strongly link this to empowering patients and democratizing access.
Yes, they do. They highlight the smartphone as a great instrument for empowering patients to actively manage their own health on a daily basis. It offers the potentially cheap, secure, and fast approach to obtaining clinical insights that can be used by both the patient and their clinician.
Right.
And crucially, as we touched on earlier, it offers a pathway to reach individuals who might face those significant geographical, financial, or stigma-related barriers that prevent them accessing the traditional health system.
So it expands reach.
It aligns very strongly with the goal of putting patients first and expanding access to care beyond those traditional boundaries.
What about more structured digital interventions? What specific technologies are discussed in this digital mental health space within the sources?
The sources discuss several key ones. Chatbots, for instance.
Chatbots, AI conversations?
Essentially, yes. Digital systems designed to interact using natural language processing. Their use for mental health promotion and basic care is increasing.
Right.
And the sources see them as potentially democratizing access to psychotherapeutic care, making some level of support available 24/7.
Right.
Well, they also note that this area is still in quite early development. And there's a current lack of standardization in how studies evaluating them are conducted, which makes it hard to compare results effectively.
Okay. What else?
Telepsychiatry is another key technology mentioned, which of course saw a massive, rapid uptake during the COVID-19 pandemic when face-to-face consultations just weren't available for many.
Yes, huge shift then.
Huge. The sources mention its recognition across several cultures now as a valid substitute for in-person sessions. Reviews cited in the material suggest success in terms of patient and clinician satisfaction, decreased no-show rates, because those logistical barriers, like travel, are removed.
Makes sense.
And it's considered well-established now for specific populations like older adults, children, and adolescents. Furthermore, some reviews suggest it seems broadly equivalent to traditional therapy regarding the therapeutic alliance.
The therapeutic alliance, the connection between therapist and patient.
Exactly, which is, of course, a critical component of successful outcomes in therapy.
So with all these tools, the continuous monitoring, the chatbots, telepsychiatry, does this material paint a picture of a future digital clinic? Is that where we're heading?
Absolutely. The sources explicitly paint a picture of a potential digital clinic that could leverage these capabilities.
What would that look like?
Well, it could involve real-time monitoring of symptoms using smartphones and various sensors, as we discussed. This stream of complex data would ideally be curated by skilled professionals who can translate these insights into accessible information.
So not just raw data overload.
No, definitely not. The idea is that this allows for data-driven, accessible, shared decision-making between the patient and their clinician. It's about using the technology and the data it generates to provide a richer, more continuous understanding of the patient's state, enabling more informed discussions and treatment choices.
Right.
The technology in this vision is meant to enhance, not entirely replace, the human element of care.
That's a key point. And finally, in this segment, the sources call out a specific category, digital therapeutics or DTX. How are these different from, say, a wellness app, and what examples are given?
Right, digital therapeutics are presented as a distinct category. Unlike general wellness apps, DTX are defined as high-quality software programs designed explicitly to prevent, manage, or treat a specific medical disorder or disease.
Okay, so they make medical claims.
Exactly. And they often require regulatory approval, much like a drug or a medical device would.
Oh, I see.
The sources note their particularly high growth in the mental health space. They mention the first FDA-approved DTX was back in 2017 for substance use and opioid use disorder.
Right.
Interestingly, the COVID-19 pandemic actually spurred a more streamlined review process for digital health devices addressing psychiatric disorders, which helped accelerate the market entry for several DTX products.
Any examples mentioned?
Yes, examples cited in the sources include things like an app-guided hardware device designed to treat depression, specific products for improving sleep, and even a video game platform that has been cleared as an adjunct treatment for ADHD.
A video game as treatment.
As an adjunct treatment, yes. The sources discuss the potential for DTX to become a sort of default tool prescribed by clinicians, perhaps similar to how pharmacotherapy is used today, particularly if the necessary infrastructure, things like digital formularies and reimbursement models, develop alongside it.
But it's not all rosy.
No, they do inject a note of caution. They state that while the field is advancing rapidly, early trials haven't universally shown all positive results, which really just underscores the need for continued rigorous evaluation.
That's a really clear distinction then, DTX as regulated medical interventions. It's clear there's immense technological potential reshaping how care is delivered, from that system-level flow right down to individual patient monitoring. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've explored how digital tools are starting to reshape healthcare delivery, especially in mental health. Now we're shifting focus a bit to the engine driving much of this potential, the power of big data and machine learning.
The engine room, you might say.
Exactly. The sources really delve into this as foundational. How do they actually define big data? And specifically, what are these V's they mention? It sounds a bit technical.
It does, but it's a useful framework. The sources spend time defining big data because it is distinct from traditional data sets. They use the widely accepted framework of the 5 V's.
Okay, the 5 V's, what are they?
All right, first there's velocity. This refers to the increasing speed at which data is generated, often in real time, from all sorts of connected devices.
Right, speed.
Second is volume, just the sheer massive amount of data being produced, constantly growing. Terabytes, petabytes.
Huge scale.
Huge. Third is variety, the highly diversified nature of the data. It comes from countless sources: electronic health records, EHRs, mobile devices, social media, genomics, sensors. And it's in different formats too: structured numerical data, unstructured text notes, images, audio.
Okay, some messy data.
Can be, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads to the fourth V, veracity. This speaks to the reliability, the accuracy, the trustworthiness of the data, which is a critical factor given the diverse sources and the potential for errors or bias.
How good is the data, basically?
Yeah, essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, the fifth V is value, the practical applicability and utility of the data. Can we actually extract meaningful insights and, well, value from this vast, sometimes messy pool?
Right. Does it actually tell us anything useful?
Exactly. And this whole picture contrasts quite starkly with small data, which typically involves static, cross-sectional data collected from specific population samples. Big data often aims for an and-all approach, attempting to capture continuous information from entire systems or very large populations.
That framework really helps clarify what we mean by big data. So how does machine learning, this branch of AI, actually leverage this massive, complex data?
Well, machine learning is fundamentally about systems that learn automatically from data without being explicitly programmed for every single possible scenario.
Learning from experience, like humans.
In a way, yes. It uses mathematical models that learn relationships and patterns implicitly from the data they're fed. The sources highlight how this is particularly relevant in areas like psychiatry, because these models can handle the complex, multidimensional data sets generated by mobile sensors, EHRs, genomic data, all those sources that constitute big data.
Okay.
They broadly discuss two main categories relevant here. There's supervised learning, yes, where the model is trained on a data set that includes both the input variables and the desired output or outcome. For example, predicting a diagnosis based on a set of symptoms. It learns to map the inputs to the outputs, and then applies this learning to predict outcomes on new, unseen data.
Okay. Training it with answers?
You could put it that way. The other main type is unsupervised learning. This involves exploring unlabeled data without predefined answers to find inherent structures or clusters within it. For example, grouping patients with similar symptom patterns together, even without a predefined diagnosis in mind.
Finding hidden patterns.
Precisely.
This ability to find patterns in complex data leads to some incredibly sensitive, but as you say, potentially vital applications discussed in the sources, specifically predicting severe outcomes like suicide risk and psychosis risk. How is big data and machine learning being applied in these areas according to the material?
The sources highlight the pressing need for more individualized prediction when it comes to suicide risk. Traditional methods, as we know, often rely on population-level statistics or simple risk checklists.
Which aren't always accurate for an individual.
Exactly. They have limitations in predicting risk for a specific individual at a specific time. This is where precision psychiatry comes back in using that multidimensional big data processed by sophisticated algorithms to make more accurate, individualized predictions of mental health outcomes. And crucially, to guide targeted preventative interventions.
Right. Proactive, not just reactive.
Hopefully. The courses discuss machine learning models developed specifically for high-risk populations, such as individuals with mood disorders or bipolar disorder. These models use a really wide array of data clinical variables from EHRs, demographic information, and in some research studies, even genomic data.
And how accurate are they?
Well, the sources mention some promising accuracy rates in specific studies. They cite AUCs, that's Arioba, under the receiver operating characteristic curve, a measure of accuracy ranging from 0.77 up to as high as 0.98 in predicting suicide attempts within certain populations in some studies.
0.98. That sounds incredibly high.
It is very high for this kind of prediction, yes. An AUC close to 1 indicates very high accuracy in distinguishing between those who will and won't experience the outcome. They also identify key predictors that these models consistently highlight as significant.
Like what?
Things like prior hospitalizations, the presence of comorbidities, other health conditions, psychotic symptoms, previous suicide attempts, which is understandably a very strong predictor, and the presence of a personality disorder.
Okay. That makes sense.
The sources cite machine learning models for suicide risk prediction showing promising accuracy, with AUCs up to 0.98 in some studies, identifying key predictors like previous suicide attempts and personality disorder. This shifts us towards precision psychiatry, making individualized predictions from vast data sets.
Those accuracy numbers, particularly that 0.98, are quite striking for something as complex as suicide risk. Moving on to psychosis risk, the sources specifically mention something called a transdiagnostic risk calculator. What exactly is that, and why is it needed?
Right, this is a fascinating example of trying to put prediction into actual clinical practice. The calculator was developed and then externally validated within the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, known as SLAM, one of the largest mental health providers in the UK.
Okay, SLAM. And why develop it?
The why is crucial. Many individuals who eventually go on to experience a first episode of psychosis are not identified during the potentially high-risk prodromal stages, the early warning phase, through traditional clinical routes. They slip through the net.
Right.
This calculator is designed for systematic detection of psychosis risk within secondary mental health care populations, basically by screening routine data that's already been collected.
Screening existing data.
Right.
Okay. What's special about it?
Its core characteristics, as detailed in the sources, are quite innovative. Firstly, it's lifespan inclusive. It can be applied to individuals of any age. It uses clinically based predictors, features identified through clinical knowledge, as being associated with psychosis risk, selected through a rigorous process. It's transdiagnostic,
Transdiagnostic, meaning?
meaning it works across different diagnostic categories or presentations. It's not just for people already labeled as high risk for psychosis.
Okay.
It provides individualized risk estimates rather than just a binary yes or no. It's designed to be cheap and automated, screening EHRs in the background, so it's highly scalable for large populations. And finally, it's built for e-health implementation, designed to be integrated directly into clinical systems.
So it's designed to catch people who might otherwise slip through that net. Has it actually been tested outside of SLAM where it was developed?
That's exactly the intention.
Right.
And yes, the sources do discuss replication studies in other UK settings, specifically Camden and Islington and Oxford Health NHS trusts.
And did it work there too?
These studies were important because these populations had key differences compared to SLAM, for instance. CNI had an older average age, fewer males, different prevalence rates for things like substance use or anxiety disorders. Despite these variations, the risk calculator retained acceptable performance. The sources quote a Harrell's C statistic of 0.73.
Harrell's C, similar to AUC.
Yes, it's a similar measure of discrimination. A value of 0.73 indicates the model has a reasonably good ability to discriminate between individuals who will and won't develop psychosis, though obviously not perfect.
Okay. And was it actually used in practice?
Yes, an important feasibility study integrated this calculator directly into the SLAM EHR system. It automatically screened over 3,700 individuals receiving care, and it flagged 115 who were identified as being at elevated risk according to the model.
And did clinicians act on those flags?
Crucially, yes. The study tracked the clinical response. 77% of clinicians whose patients received an alert responded to it in some way, and 55% of those responses resulted in a referral for a more refined in-person psychosis assessment.
And did those people actually develop psychosis?
Well, the incidence of psychosis within 6 months for the individuals who were detected by the calculator and then subsequently assessed was 12%, which is actually comparable to the incidence seen in traditional, clinically defined high-risk groups identified through other means.
Wow.
So, this outcome strongly supports the calculator's potential for systematic detection at scale.
That is genuinely fascinating, taking routine clinical data and using it proactively to identify risk at a population level within a health service. Amazing. The sources also briefly touch on how data is providing insights into other human behaviors, mentioning gaming and dating apps. What do they highlight there?
They do touch on these, yes, perhaps more as examples of how data can illuminate behavior outside traditional clinical settings. They note that gaming disorder is now recognized in the ICD-11 classification.
The International Classification of Diseases.
Correct. And it's associated with other conditions like depression, anxiety, ADHD, and also comorbidities, with things like excessive social media use, gambling, and substance use. Data from gaming platforms themselves can potentially reveal patterns of behavior relevant to diagnosis and intervention. They mention data showing a higher prevalence of gaming disorder in males, potentially linked to industry strategy or perhaps achievement drives, but they also acknowledge rising female participation and the potential for bias in the research itself.
Right, and dating apps.
Dating apps are also mentioned, highlighting their surprisingly long history. Apparently, computer-matched parties existed as far back as 1959.
Really? 1959.
So the sources say, and of course they're massive growth now. Studies using data from these apps or surveys of users provide insights into user characteristics, suggesting users are more likely to be men, young adults, and sexual minorities, and also into personality traits, with studies using models like the Big Five indicating higher open-mindedness and extroversion, maybe lower conscientiousness, and high sensation-seeking. These points just illustrate how our digital footprints across various platforms can become sources of data for understanding behavior, sometimes behavior linked to mental health.
It's clear the potential of data and AI is immense across so many aspects of life and health. But these technologies also bring significant challenges, don't they? The sources explicitly acknowledge this. What are the main ethical issues and privacy concerns highlighted as critical hurdles?
They are indeed presented as paramount concerns, particularly mental health, where the data involved is inherently so sensitive, so personal.
Absolutely.
Patient and participant privacy is stressed as absolutely critical. There's significant worry raised over the potential misuse of this personal data. Examples given include companies potentially branding or targeting products specifically at vulnerable populations based on their digital data.
Exploiting vulnerability.
Potentially, yes. Or the risk of data being traded to third parties without explicit informed consent. The sources cite some worrying findings that many mental health apps currently on the market simply don't adhere to clinical or ethical guidelines, and their privacy policies are often either absent entirely or deeply flawed, failing to adequately protect user data.
That's quite concerning.
It is, and this lack of standardization and regulation, particularly in contexts like the USA, which is mentioned specifically, contributes significantly to a lack of public confidence. The forces include a figure suggesting only about 8% of users are willing to share their health data with technology companies.
Only 8%. That really underscores the depth of this trust issue, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's a major barrier.
And with literally thousands of apps out there, how are clinicians or even patients themselves supposed to know which ones are safe and effective?
That's another significant challenge the sources highlight. The sheer number of available apps makes evaluation incredibly difficult, both for professionals and for consumers.
An impossible task, almost.
Almost. There's considerable variation in the evaluation frameworks that do exist,
Yeah.
which makes comparing apps tricky. The sources explicitly call for the development of standardized, robust quality measures and clear guidance for clinicians on how to evaluate and potentially recommend apps.
Right.
They make it very clear that simply relying on ratings or descriptions in app stores is nowhere near sufficient for ensuring quality and safety.
Okay. Beyond just evaluating the apps themselves, how do these new data-driven technologies impact the clinician's actual workflow, their daily practice? It must require a fundamental shift in how they work.
It absolutely does. The
Man.
sources really stress that clinicians need to fundamentally alter their way of working to effectively and ethically incorporate these advanced data-driven technologies.
It's not just learning new software, then.
No, not at all. It requires them to engage directly with technologists, with engineers, to truly understand how these tools function, what their limitations are, and importantly, to ensure their use doesn't compromise clinical or ethical duties.
Right, bridging that gap.
Precisely. The sources also mention the need for developing new competencies for health professionals in using other emergent technologies like augmented reality, simulation, gamification, which are also finding applications in healthcare training and delivery.
Mm.
Integrating apps into existing clinical workflows, providing staff training on how to use them and interpret the data, deciding on the appropriate level of clinical oversight for patient app use, handling the complexities of data sharing and interpretation. These are all presented as significant practical challenges.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the move towards these potential real-time assessment models means clinicians will need to actively consider not just whether an app exists, but if the data it provides is genuinely valuable to clinical decision-making, and if it actually helps demonstrate real progress for the patient. Is it useful?
It sounds like navigating all this requires a lot of cross-disciplinary understanding, a lot of collaboration.
It certainly does.
Which brings us back to the human element. How do clinicians, patients, and even these AI systems like chatbots actually interact effectively and safely according to these sources?
Collaboration and communication are highlighted as absolutely essential for successful adoption. Introducing advanced technologies into healthcare requires a concerted effort from all parties involved, clinicians, patients, technologists, to understand one another's perspectives, needs, capabilities, and to co-create innovations that are acceptable and genuinely beneficial to everyone.
Co-creation again.
Yes. Clinicians, as we've said, need to engage with technologists to ensure tools are clinically appropriate and ethically sound. Patients and clinicians should also engage with data scientists to understand how advanced data-driven technologies work, allowing them to make informed decisions about their use and interpretation.
Is there willingness for that engagement?
The sources note that there is empirical evidence indicating a general willingness among these groups to engage, which needs to be actively encouraged, fostering a sense of shared responsibility in how these technologies are developed and deployed in practice.
And specifically with chatbots, where the interaction can feel almost human-like sometimes, are there unique risks or relational considerations the sources point out?
Yes, the sources do raise specific concerns regarding the relational aspects of interacting with chatbots, particularly in sensitive areas like mental health.
How so?
Well, while chatbots interact using natural language, internally they are processing text strings. They may potentially miss nonverbal cues or nuances like, say, urgency conveyed in spoken language.
Right, the tone.
Exactly. Concerns are noted regarding the potential for users to form attachments to bots, perhaps leading to codependency, or for users to be overly credulous, too unquestioning of the bot's responses, especially given their often human-like features and that 247 availability.
Blurring lines.
It can, and this creates a difficult dilemma. While human validation and monitoring of chatbot responses might be needed for safety, particularly given the potential for unexpected or even harmful outputs, this oversight could simultaneously jeopardize the patient's privacy in their communication with the chatbot.
A real balancing act?
It highlights the delicate balance needed between safety, effectiveness, and privacy in these kinds of interactions.
So despite all the incredible technology, all the data, the importance of the human connection and care remains absolutely central.
Absolutely. The sources reinforce this point strongly. The fundamental value in therapy sessions, whether conducted online, via telepsychiatry, or in person, is the therapist's focused attention on the patient,
The relationship.
the relationship. The technology, whether it's real-time monitoring data curated by a professional or communication tools, should ideally enable and enhance this therapeutic focus in the human relationship, not aim to replace that essential connection entirely.
Right. Augment, not replace.
Precisely. They mention the need for investment in leadership to develop digital clinician pathways, which would involve training and infrastructure to support clinicians in leveraging these tools effectively while always maintaining the centrality of the patient relationship.
This has been a really detailed and comprehensive exploration of a rapidly evolving field. To wrap things up, let's do a quick lightning round. Drawing on some specific details from the sources we've discussed, just quick, sharp answers based on the material if you can.
Yeah, go ahead.
One digital tool mentioned that allowed for basic medical exams at home, perhaps during a lockdown scenario.
Tied-at-home remote exam kits were mentioned.
Okay. Beyond just helping with diagnosis, how else can digital phenotyping provide value in areas like mood disorders? Give me a couple of ways.
Right. It can assist physicians by collecting signs continuously, process those signs into mood and behavior patterns, compare current data to a patient's baseline, enhance the detection of initial signs, tailor interventions, even suggest context-aware coping strategies. Lots of potential applications.
Okay. After the big surge during the pandemic, what's a key challenge mentioned for widespread, equitable telepsychiatry access going forward?
Access to the necessary technology and adequate training for professionals to use it effectively. Those two are key.
Right. And finally, one core skill needed for senior leadership roles in health tech, like a chief clinical information officer or CCIO, something that goes beyond just being technically savvy, being good with computers.
Change management, definitely. Understanding human factors, a deep understanding of systems and organizations, and critically, being good with people, not just computers.
Brilliant. Thank you. Now let's try and distill some actionable takeaways from this deep dive. Key points for you, the professional listener, to consider based only on the source material we've covered.
Okay. Based on our discussion, here are perhaps some key considerations drawn directly from the sources.
Okay,
Firstly, digital transformation in healthcare isn't just about adding some new tools. It really necessitates a fundamental reform of health systems.
Right.
This requires properly integrating care across different levels: hospitals, primary care, home care, and significantly investing in developing new competencies for health professionals so they can effectively and ethically use these emergent technologies.
Okay, fundamental reform, new skills. What's next?
Secondly, digital mental health tools covering things like digital phenotyping, mobile apps, telepsychiatry, chatbots, they hold substantial potential for expanding access to care and enabling truly personalized interventions.
Nice.
But their successful implementation really hinges on rigorous validation, very careful ethical consideration, and finding ways for seamless integration into existing clinical workflows and practices. It needs to work in the real world.
Validation, ethics, integration. Got it. Third takeaway.
Thirdly, leveraging the power of big data and AI, specifically machine learning, offers powerful capabilities for predicting individual risk trajectories, particularly in sensitive domains like suicide and psychosis risk prediction.
The precision psychiatry idea.
Exactly. But this power is absolutely contingent on having access to robust, high-quality data. It demands transparency in how the predictive models actually function. We need to understand them, and it requires a careful balancing act between the automated insights and essential human clinical judgment.
Data quality, transparency, human oversight. Okay. Fourth.
Fourthly, the widespread adoption of health technology introduces critical responsibilities, as highlighted quite strongly in the sources. There must be paramount attention paid to ensuring patient safety and data privacy.
Non-negotiables.
Absolutely. Establishing clear ethical guidelines for technology use and developing standardized evaluation frameworks and potentially even new regulatory approaches are needed to build and maintain public trust.
Safety, privacy, trust through standards. Makes sense. And finally,
successful digital health adoption is perhaps fundamentally driven by human factors and effective change management. It necessitates genuine collaboration and open communication across all disciplines: clinicians, technologists, researchers, patients themselves.
everyone involved.
Yes, to co-create innovation that truly works for everyone involved, moving beyond just a sole focus on the technology itself. It's about the people and the process.
Collaboration, human factors, change management. Brilliant summary. So here's a final thought, perhaps something for you to mull over. As data and AI become increasingly central to healthcare, to prediction, particularly in these really sensitive areas like mental health, how do we ensure that the pursuit of efficiency, of precision, doesn't inadvertently erode that essential human relationship at the very heart of care?
A critical question.
It's a critical tension, isn't it? Something for us all to navigate carefully. If you found value in this deep dive today, please do rate and share the show. It genuinely helps more people discover how to quickly become well-informed on topics like this. Prof. Imam, thank you once again for guiding us so expertly through this complex but absolutely vital material today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all for this deep dive.